Good morning, Gethin. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So, Gethin, tell us who you are and tell us about the work that you do at Benifex.
So, good morning, everyone. So, my name is Gethin Nadin. I'm an award-winning and accredited psychologist. I'm also a best-selling HR author, and I write and talk at conferences about all things to do with HR, employee experience, and employee well-being. And I'm just about to celebrate my 10-year anniversary working for Benifex. We were a startup when I joined. We now have over 400 employees and more than 1 million people using our platform. And throughout that time at Benifex, I've had a number of different roles covering kind of product, marketing, sales, customer success. And now, although my title is Director Employee Wellbeing, I effectively lead all of our thought leadership in the market and then use that to inform the products we build and to better support customers. So an average week for me could kind of range from running workshops or consultancy sessions with customers to talking at conferences or events like this, writing articles for HR magazines, supporting our sales team and bids and prospects, etc., and working closely with our product team so we can build products that solve more of the employee experience problem.
And Gethin, from your experience, what has the last 18 months done to the world of work and to our experience of work?
Yeah, so it's obviously hotly debated, this kind of question. And I think there's this illusion that the pandemic changed the world of work, when I think in all reality, all it actually did was just accelerate a number of pretty fast growing trends we could already see in the workplace. You know, home working right across the world was already pretty prevalent in around a third of the workforce. And employee well-being was kind of a top 3 HR trend before anyone knew what COVID-19 was. And so I think where lots of employers have been struggling with the quick changes we've seen to the workplace, there are probably thousands of examples of employers that had already made the change that would better support things like well-being and move to a more hybrid model of working. But I think the most interesting thing where the pandemic has kind of enforced us to do stuff that employers had been pretty reticent to do historically, and that was things like experiment more with kind of trust and autonomy. And many employers were forced to trust their people just because of the way that lockdown forced us to stay at home. And so we had to trust people to manage their own time. We had to trust them to work out of sight. And we had to kind of leave it to them to collaborate more and find ways of working together. But there was a pretty significant positive payoff to that, I think. And I think we saw productivity increase, more collaboration, engagement scores increase. But we also communicated more openly, transparently, and regularly. So many of the customers I work with had CEOs that stood in front of Zoom calls or webcams and told their thousands of people that, we care about you and we care about your welfare and we want to be there for you. And basically this rhetoric changed that, people mattered to our organization and people were an important part of our organization. So it was kind of no surprise to me that during the first lockdown in the UK, we saw employee engagement scores increase for about 2/3 of UK companies because we started acting the way that I always thought we probably should have. And I think as part of that, the other big change has been, as I mentioned, this kind of reappreciation of just how adaptable and amazing that human beings are. Lots of people in our HR thought leadership type industry has talked a lot about AI and automation, and the general public are quite worried about that taking jobs away. But I think the pandemic made us realize that empathy and adaptability of people is actually what helped companies survive. And I think we realize probably more than ever that people are pretty key to our success, kind of whatever our business is. And I think very lastly, the thing that the pandemic changed as well, or maybe even accelerated, was what we as individuals want out of work and the part that work plays in our lives. So, we have evidence that millions of people right across the world were pretty unhappy with the way that their employers treated them during the pandemic. We saw organizations cut the pay of people, but continue to pay senior leadership bonuses and share payouts. We saw that some organizations didn't treat their people right, and kind of in mid-2020, I kind of predicted that the pandemic would lead us to reassess kind of our work and who we work for, and that would probably lead to a mass exodus in the workplace. And at the time, people told me I was talking nonsense, that, people needed jobs, that we had this probably the big squeeze we'd had in most economies, and there was no way people are going to have to be stuck in their jobs for years. And obviously what we've now started to see is this dawning of the Great Resignation, where right across the world, there's a very, very strong evidence. I've read about 50 studies that now indicate that around 40 to 50% of people are saying, as soon as the pandemic subsided in my country, I'm going to start looking for a new job. And I know so many people at the moment that just cannot recruit the right people. We know that if you work in hospitality or truck drivers, I'm supposed to have coffee delivered today. That's been delayed by 6 days because they don't have drivers to send the trucks out. It's a first world problem, but it's a big problem when you don't get your coffee. And so I think that, right across the world, we're starting to see people quit in record numbers. But again, if you look at data from kind of 2019, 2020, most people were quitting their jobs at a higher rate than ever before. And so I think as soon as that period of recovery comes back in, that post-pandemic recovery, we're going to have to deal with a lot of people who just very quickly go back to, do you know what, this isn't working for me. I can go on LinkedIn tomorrow, I can click a few buttons, have an interview within 2 days, and I'll be handing my notice in next week. And I think that's going to be a big, big challenge for employers, is how do I keep the best people working for me?
And Gethin, what we're talking about today is working unusually. Have you got an example that you think really crystallizes companies who are doing this successfully?
Whilst the pandemic changed so much for us, we stopped handling money, we shopped online more, video calls became the norm, and those inequalities came to the surface, and employees, I think, started to find better ways of working for them based on their home lives or the inequalities that they might have faced. And so I think what was kind of once unusual is probably going to become the norm, and I think it'll be interesting to see how that office becomes designed around the things we can't get at home. But I've also started to see as well that we're starting to reevaluate how do we measure productivity and the success of the individual. And anyone who's familiar with the role model, the results-orientated work environment, back in 2010, the experimenters who came out with this theory and started working with companies like Best Buy to test it were shot down by experts and said, this is never going to work. People measure, you get input in and there's time and then there's output. And that's how the calculation worked. And so I think, that experiment from 2010, I wrote about that in my book in 2017. Even people in 2017 told me it was rubbish and I was speaking a load of shit, that this was not going to be the way that we started to measure productivity. But I think, the idea that we should be valuing output on its own and separating that from time is something we've done as part of this mass experiment in hybrid working. So this really unusual way of so what happens if I stop measuring somebody on time and they just do the things I want? And if you ever had a sales team, for example, if I had a salesperson working for me who's had a £500,000 a year target, and in the second week of January, they walked in through the door and they signed £1 million deal, I'm going to be pretty happy with that. So I shouldn't really care too much whether that person does nothing for the rest of the week. They've done exactly what I needed them to do. And so I think that's an extreme example, but I think that working unusually is this idea that, well, maybe I can just let somebody get on with it. And if they decide that in the middle of the day they want to go shopping for an hour and a half because that's what they think is going to make them more productive or give their mind time to settle so they can come up with new ideas. And so I think that kind of change from typically usual to an unusual way of measuring productivity and better ways of valuing output is something I've been really, really excited to see. And there's a couple of examples we've seen amongst Benefex customers that I think are really interesting. So we have a large accountant customer of ours that has now started sharing photos to their social channels of their employees working on beaches and by the side of swimming pools, where they're basically saying, if you want to work remotely and you work remotely from the side of a pool, fill your boots, you're measured on output. One of our big customers, Ocado, they basically issued a press statement to say, if you want to work for Ocado and you want to move overseas and keep your job, we're going to facilitate that as much as possible. We have a sustainability company that just added female toilets to their wind turbines in the North Sea because they realised if they're going to be more diverse, if they're going to accommodate some of that quality, we need to create a place for a safe space for women to go to the toilet, not just men. So they've had to kind of go to these wind turbines and add toilets. And that's something that they probably would never have considered if we hadn't brought up some of the inequalities, on the back of things like the merger of Sarah Everard and things like that have happened in society. And then on a very small level, something that we've done at Benefex, which I really, really like, that we rolled out last week, is we've issued staff with 3 different badges for them to use during video calls. and they're kind of a sun, rain, and a cloud. And the idea is just to describe your mood. So you don't have to go to somebody to say you're not in a good place. You don't have to ask for help. You can just wear a badge that will hopefully start a conversation, or will allow us all to give each other a bit more breathing space. So if I see that, Tony, you've got your cloud on, then I know that you might not be having a great day. So that will change the way I interact with you. You know, can I make that day better for you? Can I take some work away from you? And I'll be really interested to see how that changes. But, you know, huge change, unusual way of working, because we're being a lot softer with each other. And I think that's a really big step forward. And I don't think being soft with employees is a dirty word or dirty phrase.
And Gethin, a final question for you this morning before we let you go is, what would your top piece of advice be for our audience?
Difficult to choose one, so I'm going to try and expand that to kind of 1.5 or something if I can. I think we need to ask people more what they need and what they want, and really listen to what they tell us. I don't think we should be passing off what they tell us or give them excuses as to why we can't do the things that they want. You know, people have got us through this pandemic, and I think the least we could do is kind of ask them what they need and try and deliver as much as possible what they need to be successful. And an example I always use is, you know, famously we hear about people like Mariah Carey having riders when she goes on stage, this list of things I need to perform best. If you're part of the England football team, the night before a match, you know, you're given a nutritious meal, you're given rest, you're taken to a spa hotel, because everyone's focused on how do I get this person to perform the best. So why don't we think about our employees the same way? Why aren't we thinking, my sales guys have got this really big pitch tomorrow. Why don't I just give them the afternoon off so they can go and play golf or have a walk or do whatever it is to get into the mindset so that they perform, rather than let's just squeeze every minute and every hour out of employees. I think the pandemic showed us that there are unique characteristics of kind of resilience, emotional intelligence and flexibility that people bring to businesses. As I mentioned before, I think they're quick to adapt, they generate ideas, they provide great customer experiences. And I think that ability to empathize and sympathize was valuable. And as I mentioned, but beyond anything currently a machine can achieve. So I would say the big piece of advice would be invest in your people, spend time with them, spend money on them if you can, be experimental. You know, for years before the pandemic, many people would argue with me about hybrid working wouldn't work in their organization. But for 2 years, for many of them, we've proved it has. And for some of those businesses that told me it would never work are now recruiting people from overseas and are opening offices in different locations and have people working for them who started working the last 6 months who are hundreds of miles away from the office. So they've really kind of grabbed hold of flexible and remote and hybrid working. And it just makes me think, you know, what else is holding us back? We need to cast off the old ways of what we think about work and how we measure productivity and how we engage people. You know, there are companies out there that I work with that are experimenting with, as I mentioned, new ways of measuring productivity, or changing the idea of what the working week is and what the working hours look like, and really putting their arms around employees and holding them tight and really caring for them. And so I think, yeah, asking employees, being open, being transparent. And I don't think anyone listening to this needs to be $1 billion business or have a large budget to be a great employer. I think most of this is just about care, about caring for people.
Wonderful. Well, Gethin, I think that's a fantastic place to leave it. Thank you very much for your time this morning and for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us.
Thank you very much. Hope it was useful.